Hello and welcome. My name is Michael Vasquez. My pronouns are he, him, el, and I'm the Religion and Faith Director here at the Human Rights Campaign. Welcome to the 7th installment of Remaining Home in Faith. Our series tonight, we will be looking at the religious right assault on the LGBTQ community and how in the face of those assaults, we can carve a path forward for justice and equity for all. When we began this series in March, we embarked on a mission to establish common ground between the movement for LGBTQ equity and justice and diverse religious communities across the country. Faced with the COVID-19 pandemic, racial injustice, and the threat of nationalism that has devastated our nation, intensified division, and left us all searching for hope and a different way of being collectively, the Human Rights Campaign is committed as ever to deepen our relationship with faith communities and explore how finding common ground in pursuit of the common good can allow us to build a society that is just and equitable for all. A pluribus unum, out of many one, is our nation's principal founding motto, and it is one that reminds us that we are a diverse nation that together can forge a society that honors and defends each other's dignity, combating discrimination, providing for the general welfare, ensuring that everyone is able to flourish. While we have not achieved that vision yet, the driving force behind this great American experiment is the audacious hope that it can, in fact, come into being. Progressive people of faith throughout our nation's history have worked tirelessly to see this come into being. From the fight for abolition to the civil rights movement, from the movement for LGBTQ rights to the movement for Black lives, progressive people of faith have stood as a pillar against the assaults of hate and discrimination, violence, and bigotry. Tonight, we get the opportunity to hear a conversation about where we have been and where we still have to go. This is a truth-telling session that pulls back the curtain on the state of play in our nation and allows us, in the process, to thus prophetically imagine a new world rooted in radical love and justice. With that, it is my honor and privilege to introduce President of the Human Rights Campaign, Alphonso David, who will be having a conversation with Katherine Stewart, award-winning journalist and author of The Power Worshippers: Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism. Welcome both.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Michael. And Katherine, thank you for joining us this evening.
Oh, thank you so much, Alphonso. I'm so grateful to you and HRC for having me.
You're welcome. This year, we have faced many crises: a devastating pandemic, an unprecedented economic crisis, a global uprising for racial justice, and the deadliest year on record for fatal violence against transgender and gender nonconforming people, which largely impacts Black and brown transgender women. And yet, in the face of these challenges, a diverse and broad pro-coalition, pro-democracy coalition has mobilized to effect change, which recently culminated in the election of President-elect Joe Biden and Vice President-elect Kamala Harris. While there is a lot of hope about what this new administration means for the future of this nation, we know this election does not solve all of our problems and that there is much work to be done. To begin our discussion tonight, Katherine, I want to start with the concept of religious nationalism, which you have written about and tracked extensively, and especially here in the United States. First, can you define what is religious nationalism?
Thanks, Alphonso, for that great question. You know, sometimes a label is just a label, but sometimes it gets to the essence of things. And these terms like religious right or Christian conservatism, and Christian nationalism more or less all refer to the same or largely overlapping groups of people. But they have different connotations and emphases depending on the context. And I chose the term religious nationalism for the subtitle of my book, Inside the Dangerous Rise of Religious Nationalism, because it emphasizes the aspects of this movement that matter most. Religious nationalism the term tells us that this is, number one, a political movement. That is, it wants political power. It's not just a cultural movement, and it's using political means to acquire that political power. It tells us that it's a movement that makes use of religion, but it isn't really a religious movement. It's exploiting religion for political power. And it is made up largely but not entirely, of people who identify as Christian. But they're not limited to any one particular denomination. In fact, most American Christians, I believe, reject the politics of conquest and division that this movement represents. Another reason I actually like the label is because it reminds us that this isn't exclusively an American thing. So when you look around the world and look at political leaders like Putin in Russia, or Duda in Poland, or Erdogan in Turkey, when these sort of leaders ally themselves with hyper-conservative religious authorities in their own countries in order to consolidate a more authoritarian form of political power, we rightly recognize this as a form of religious nationalism. And that's what we're seeing, unfortunately, what we have seen, unfortunately, in America, certainly under the Trump administration.
Now, let's talk a little bit more about that specifically, because now we've defined what religious nationalism is, and we're coming to the closing weeks of 2020. Can you give us your assessment of where you think we are today in this country as it relates to religious nationalism? And if you can also talk a little bit about how we got here.
Sure. I mean, under President Trump, the movement achieved unprecedented access, political access. They made tremendous gains in the courts. I think the number is something like 221 federal justices, 3 Supreme Court justices, and so many others. And the movement just really sort of had, I believe, power that has been unprecedented in the modern era. But look, with this last election, we've dodged a bullet that was aiming straight for democracy. This is a radically anti-democratic movement. So we kind of have a new lease, in a way, on our democracy. But frankly, it's pretty tenuous. And there are these underlying structural issues that remain. So I want to talk about a couple of them, if you don't mind. I mean, when you're looking at one of the factors that create support for the movement, I don't think we can discount the importance of the far-right propaganda sphere, this very hermetic messaging or information, I don't want to call it information, sort of messaging sphere. We all know about right-wing media, Fox News, Breitbart, One American News Network, Epic, and all these other sort of right-wing sort of propaganda, or I should say messaging platforms. But to add to that, there's been a lot of messaging that's happened, unfortunately, the exploitation of houses of worship, conservative houses of worship. And that's a part of the story. It's often underreported because it seems disaggregate, but there are now these very large groups like right-wing policy networks and data networks and other initiatives, many of which I write about in The Power Worshippers, that synchronize that messaging, and they can convey it through these conservative churches and other means, and even when it's not entirely visible through social media. So, Trump has exploited this, of course, and makes every effort to interrupt the democratic functioning of our country by promoting today's false narrative of a stolen election, in spite of every evidence to the contrary. And I think what we've learned from history is that keeping a large part of the population in a state of illusion is really bad if you want a stable democracy.
Well, you just mentioned history, and I think it's really fascinating when we talk about history and religion that sometimes we have very skewed views about reality. Because throughout history, people of faith have been involved in pushing for progress and justice. Many continue to be on the front lines today. So how do we, as progressive advocates, if that's the appropriate word, or those who are really just focused on supporting our democracy, how do we uplift the legacy of progressives, of people of faith engaged in progress and justice, and ensure that it's really acknowledged that there is a large segment of people of faith engaged in advancing today's social justice movement?
Yeah, you're right, Alphonso. That's absolutely true. And I think one place we need to start to take back the idea of true religious freedom. Offer a positive vision of religious freedom as one centered on radical love on equality, justice, and pluralism, and offer a positive vision of America as a place where liberal religion has in fact made huge contributions. There have been social justice, religiously driven social justice movements in our country since our nation's founding. You know, practically speaking, the religious right has succeeded, I think, in some ways, offering services to pastors and other types of support for for congregations and like-minded pastors. And there's a lot of sort of networking that happens. And I think we could actually probably do a little bit more of that too, take advantage of some of the options that are available to progressive people of faith. I'd actually love to see a campaign organized around the idea of what religious freedom means to us and what really it ought to be, how it really ought to be defined, which is the right of freedom and worship and conscience, but also the freedom from having to worship if you a particular religion if you don't want to, the freedom from having to fund it, certainly if you don't want to, and absolutely the freedom from discrimination. You know, if your idea of equality and under the law is rooted in your sincerely held religious beliefs or conscience, you know, there's no liberty in this sort of radical rights idea of religious liberty. So I think that we should emphasize the fact also that the religious voices that have historically opposed evil such as slavery and segregation, the subordination of women and the like, were in fact liberal heroes, as opposed to the reactionary folks, the pro-slavery theologians certainly, and their intellectual descendants, who in many instances went along with or even have promoted these types of things.
Yeah, I mean, it's an unfortunate fact that many people don't fully appreciate, I think, in some cases, that religion, unfortunately, has been used in some cases to further marginalize minority groups. Mm-hmm. Whether we're talking about women or Black people, slavery, anti-miscegenation laws, and all of those, you know, concepts were in some ways advanced through the halls of religion in some cases. Certainly not all people supported them, but the way it's framed in some cases through our history sometimes misguides people into thinking that there are no people of faith who actually support social justice, when in fact that's not the case.
It's amazing. In The Power Worshippers, I wrote a chapter in which I sort of showed the contrast between the pro-slavery theologians, people like Robert Louis Dabney or James Henley Thornwell, these theologians who actually were on the side of slavery. Frederick Douglass called them the $5,000 divines, meaning $5,000 is a lot of money at the time. The sort of very well-funded theologians who either had made their peace with slavery or at least, or in some cases were actively promoting it. And then I also wrote about a dozen abolitionist theologians who argued the cause of liberation, as Douglass said, from humble pulpits. They tended to be less well-funded. They weren't on the side of quote-unquote personal property. So they didn't have as much money flowing in their direction necessarily, but there are about a dozen that I've written about, and so many others, theologians who argued against slavery, desegregated the pews. But you know what's really interesting about that is that the anti-slavery theologians, the theologians who were arguing for liberation, they were not arguing for these strict hierarchies rooted in the Bible. They tended to be on the side of women's rights too. For which many of them were sort of castigated as promoting what the sort of conservative religious authorities at the time called promiscuous assemblies, as though having women speak in church was somehow promoting promiscuity. But the inheritors of this tradition, of the liberal theology, the inheritors of that tradition are those arguing for equal rights for all, tolerance, pluralism, and it's the inheritors of the other tradition that are arguing for strict biblical literalism, the idea of hierarchies rooted in the Bible, and a sort of fusion of the idea of America with a particular sort of religious and cultural identities, which are always very sort of hierarchical and strict and literalist. So there's always been very different ways to experience religion in our country.
Well, when you talk about our history, I think sometimes because unfortunately our history is not told in the way that reflects reality, it sometimes gets viewed through a purely academic lens and is considered suspect. But there is data, at least if we were to fast forward today, there is data that shows that the majority of voters, for instance, in the United States support LGBTQ non-discrimination protections, including across all religions traditions, from white Protestants to Hispanic Catholics. You touched on this a few minutes ago, but if we can talk a little bit more and dig into this a little deeper, why has the religious right been so effective in painting a different picture, although the majority of people, including the majority of people of faith, support non-discrimination protections for LGBTQ people?
One reason, it's a really good question. One reason is that the right has invested, so the radical right has invested for decades in all of the features of modern political campaign infrastructure, data, media, messaging. So they have these disproportionate political power, and their messaging around non-discrimination protection is extremely loud. I mean, remember, they are a minority of the population. I think the most devoted religious rights supporters number just, according to George Barna, the evangelical pollster, just 10% of the population. But say in 2016, where we have the data, 91% turned out to vote and 93% voted for Trump. So they're disproportionately organized. They vote in disproportionate numbers, and they've just got all of these sort of, messaging features, messaging platforms that they've invested in for a really long time. So, I think what happens is many people base their judgments not on what the majority of Americans want, but they sort of base it more on who has the power. So the fact that a substantial majority of Americans are in favor of LGBT equality matters less in a way than the fact that an anti-LGBT party controls a substantial majority of the Supreme Court and 53% or so of the Senate. Like, you can lose the war of public opinion, as frankly I think that they have, but still win the war of politics, still win the war of political power. So, the religious right is right about one thing. The rest of us are winning the culture war in that most Americans agree with us that in non-discrimination protection and the like, but they're sometimes in a country where you have a sort of disproportionate minority, with the minority of the population having disproportionate political power, thanks to sort of structural issues in our voting, and also the right is, frankly, I think, much more organized than the left and turn out to vote in larger numbers. You can lose the political war.
Are there specific, now that you've looked at these issues for quite some time, you've certainly studied them, are there specific tools that you've identified that have been effective, that could be just as effective for those that are advancing, democracy, inclusion, and not really using what you call religious nationalism as a tool for division?
Absolutely. I mean, I look at the reason I wrote The Power Worshippers is because I really saw that the religious right, was a machine. It was like a political machine. It had all these different features. They have very sophisticated data initiatives. They have policy groups. They have legal advocacy groups. That are much better funded than our legal advocacy groups, for instance, or at least also much more targeted. They have networking organizations that get everybody on the same page. They have legislative initiatives like, I don't know if you're aware of Project Blitz, that kind of craft model legislation and send different versions of the same bill, or sometimes the same versions of the same type of model bill out through numerous states. I mean, they're just really organized. And so I wrote the book because I just wanted to take readers inside the machinery and see how it works. I really don't think that we can meet our challenges as a country unless people really know what it is that we're up against. And here's the great news. We have the numbers and we have the power, and I think we just need to sort of exercise it. One thing the right has done really well is they train the rank and file to vote on the issue of judges. They recognize, I think a lot of them, that they're not going to win the war of public opinion. So their only way they're going to get their agenda met is by acting through the courts. And so I've been to religious right events where like speakers will stand up and say, this election is about judges, judges, judges. I've never heard that at a progressive political event, but it'd be nice to hear stuff like that, just a little more emphasis of the importance of judges. And they unify when necessary, and I think that that's pretty key.
And we've spent a lot of time talking about religious nationalism, and I want to just shift for a second, to the extent there is a shift, whether it be in language or lexicon, and talk about religious freedom, because that terminology, religious freedom, is often used as coded language for a license to discriminate not only against LGBTQ people, but also people of color, women, and religious minorities. Can you talk a little bit about what religious freedom at least means to you and how is often interpreted?
Sure. True religious freedom is the freedom of conscience, freedom of thought, freedom of worship. It also includes the idea of being required or obliged to finance or participate in any religion if you don't want to. But it's a really important principle in our country. Freedom of worship and the separation of religion and government, I think, often go hand in hand. One of the reasons we have such a vibrant and diverse religious landscape in our country is because of the principle of church-state separation, which has allowed a lot of religious entrepreneurs to flourish, and a lot of different people of all faiths to come from all over the world and sort of practice their faith freely, relatively speaking. But, in the hands of the religious nationalists, the term religious liberty has come to mean something like its opposite. It's become almost an Orwellian term that means religious privilege. They're really trying to turn it into the idea that people who believe correctly, certain variety of conservative people of faith, should be permitted to discriminate against LGBT people and others whose characteristics or even very being offends them. So this privileges, obviously, certain religious viewpoints over others. And, all these discriminatory acts, I just want to say, like the efforts to exempt healthcare workers from having to care for queer people, or landlords from having to rent same-sex couples or bake cakes or whatever. These acts are really, we often think about them in terms of the harms that they do to the targets. They think, well, it's going to cause, people who are members of same-sex couples to not be able to, claim the benefits that they could claim if they're married, or not be able to sort of rent an apartment or whatever. But the harm is much more than that. It's really beyond depriving this couple or that individual of their rights. The real goal, I think, of these types of what they call religious freedom, but are really like privilege to discriminate actions, is it's to enshrine a kind of disrespect for certain groups, to basically identify certain groups as worthy of contempt, as worthy of potential discrimination, and to have that contempt validated by the law. And the harm that flows from that is really not so much about it's about individual rights, but it's also about a harm that it delegitimizes our democracy. And it destroys our democracy. It delegitimizes the idea that we are out of many one, that every citizen is deserving of equal rights and equal respect. And what matters for this harm is it then becomes political, acceptable, I think, to name some specific set of others who are not so-called legitimate or members of the so-called real people, not the real Americans. And this kind of identification of an eternal enemy is always a prelude to an authoritarian response. I mean, look at how this plays out in parts of the world like Poland, where a third of municipalities, it's really shameful, a third of municipalities are now declared anti-LGBT zones. So, well, what follows from that? Once you've got, the assault on queer people, you also have assault on women's rights, freedom of the press, freedom of expression, and it all ends up being a means for a more nationalist authoritarian government to consolidate its power and crack down on a whole broad range of rights and fairness across the board. It sets the stage for religious authoritarianism. So that's a little bit high level, and it's in no way meant to be dismissive at all of the rights of individuals when it comes to this kind of anti-LGBT rhetoric and policies. But I think that we need to see the fact that the cause of the LGBT community is the cause of democracy. It is the cause of humankind. And we cannot, allow one group in society to become scapegoats on this level, because that is always a kind of, it always precedes this kind of religious authoritarianism.
Katherine Stewart, thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you for your scholarship. Thank you for doing all of the work that you've done on this issue, and highlight for people how important it is that as we fight to reclaim our democracy, we have to really truly appreciate how religion, unfortunately, in some cases, is misinterpreted, misused in order to further marginalize communities that are already marginalized, including the LGBTQ community. For those who are watching, we continue to fight for equality. We believe that LGBTQ people are entitled to all of the rights, privileges, and protections as everyone else. We are contributing members of society, and we should be entitled to all of those rights and privileges without interfering with the rights of anyone else. And we hope that this conversation was illuminating and informative as we all think about how we can reclaim our democracy for all of us. Thank you all for joining us tonight. I'm going to now turn it back over to Michael Vasquez.
Thank you both. Really appreciate hearing you both share. And thank you everyone for joining in and watching tonight. In closing, just want to share a quote out of Katherine's book, where she writes, "In some ways, Christian nationalism is the fruit of a society that has not yet lived up to the promise of the American idea. There's work to be done, but for now we are free to do it. We have met challenges in the past well enough, at least, to make it to the present moment. Religious nationalists are using the tools of democratic political culture to end democracy. I continue to believe those same resources can be used to restore it." I commend this book to you. It's been a powerful tool for us in our work, and I believe that it's incredibly informative for all of us as we pursue the work of justice and inclusion. And for further updates about the Religion and Faith program, feel free to text 472-FAITH, all caps, faith, to 472-472, or go to hrc.org/religion for our next installment in this series. Thank you for joining us tonight, and I hope you all have a good weekend. Take care.